Hello and welcome to the Oregonian Sports Podcast. I am Bill Oram, sports columnist at the Oregonian, joined this week by Brenna Greene. Brenna, it feels like we just did this. But to our listeners, it probably feels like we've been gone a long time.
Yeah. I'm very happy to see the little red recording button going. That's thrilling for us. That was not a thrilling moment about 45 minutes into our last podcast, I would say, when we noticed that it was not going, even though I stand as witness. Bill Oram did press the record button because I remember seeing the countdown on our recording software. So
I appreciate that defense. We had an episode for you last week. It was an absolute banger, best ever. Nobody can prove me wrong. And then technical difficulties. It never actually laid tape.
Even better than the Sonny Greinecker episode, which was only the best one for you and I. Nobody else cared, but that was the best one for you and I.
I enjoyed that too. But we're going to try to salvage a little bit of the last conversation we had, the pieces of it that are still relevant, looking ahead to college football as well, because we are now, Brenna, 10 days away? 11 days away from the start of college football games.
I'm ready. I'm so ready to stop talking in hypotheticals. Let's do it.
And we're going to start having some real concrete data and evidence. We're going to see Dylan Gabriel and these new receivers at Oregon. We're going to see what Oregon State is made of after the tumultuous last year. And start getting a taste of this new Mountain West hybrid schedule for the Beavers. We don't know who the quarterback's going to be, but we're going to talk about that on this episode. We're going to talk about the Ducks and their schedule and look beyond some of the obvious matchups that have people intrigued to maybe some maybe is there a trap game on their schedule? We're going to talk about that. But Brenna, the news of last week here in Portland and in Oregon at large was the Blazers finally severing ties with Root Sports. They're home since 2021, broadcasting games. Long time coming. This is something that fans had been hoping for. Root had always been a little bit difficult. It wasn't impossible to find or get, but it wasn't on all platforms. And then last year, going into last season, it got bumped up to the highest tier on Comcast, which priced a lot of people out, especially considering the Blazers were not going to be good last year. And so I don't think there was a lot of incentive for even the most loyal fans to pony up. So to recap what's already been discussed, what's already out there, what's been reported, what I've written, others have written and reported, Blazers have a plan to be on over-the-air television, which is just going to be essentially a local news station this upcoming year and going forward. They will also have a direct-to-consumer streaming service that you can subscribe to if you're not in front of your television or you don't live in an area that is covered by the antenna version of games. But basically these games are going to be available to anybody who wants to watch them pretty easily. Brenna, what are your kind of thoughts on what this means for the Blazers and their fan base?
Everything old is new again, baby. It's just so funny, thinking back to when we were kids, and I mean that's what it was. Blazers were on, local TV. They were on KGW. That's what it was. And then, it switched over to Comcast, and that was its own hullabaloo in its own right. I mean, some people had a lot of issues with that, and this has been now going on for the last, gosh, man. I mean, I was an intern at Comcast Sportsnet Northwest in 2012. So they I would imagine they had them for what? It's since mid 2000s. I forget when the changeover happened, to be honest with you. Fact check me. But this has kind of been the ongoing saga for the last at least 15 years of just where are the Blazers? Why can't I see them? Blah 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 blah. And now all of a sudden it's all coming back around. It's actually really fascinating to watch because really now it almost feels like there's a bit of an arms race to get local TV airtime because all of these regional networks are starting to go down. So now you're having to divvy it up between all the different stations and different markets. And our market isn't as intense as maybe some other ones are, but there's still, I mean, I think about the stuff that's on Root that may not be on, that we'll see if Root is in business in the next few, years. They're owned solely by the Mariners.
Yeah.
So now the only thing that they have the only professional team they have on their airwaves is the Mariners. And in terms of college sports, like, I honestly think the only college sport they have right now is Gonzaga. They used to have some Big Sky football, but they don't have that anymore. That went to Scripps. So, or I went to ESPN, excuse me. I think it went to ESPN Plus. So
yeah, everything's on ESPN Plus for the Big Sky.
Yeah, sorry. I'm thinking about the Montana and Montana State games. Those are on Scripps in Montana. Which, wow, I really got deep in the broadcasting woods there, because
we do manage to make this podcast like come home to Montana and Montana State quite often.
We do. It just is what it is. So anyways, for those like, what Scripps, they're the CBS stations in the state of Montana. They're all owned by the same company. Because contrary to popular belief, our stations are not owned by the networks we affiliate for. So CBS does not own Coin. So
that's going to become relevant to one of the points I'm going to make here soon. So nice breadcrumbing.
Well, okay, great. I'm so glad I can help you out with that. So yeah, it's just fascinating for me to kind of, as somebody who's in the business, to kind of watch this all kind of unfold this way. Because 10 years ago when I got into this, that seemed like preposterous. What? And now it's just, that's exactly what's happening, because all these regional sports networks are going down, and we'll see if Root's the next one. I don't know what the Mariners do there. I don't know what they do there. I guess one of the nice things for them is that they do own the network, so it's like, well, they aren't gonna have to go out and like if they shut it down, they know exactly what they're doing. If they keep it going, they know exactly what they're doing. They know exactly money's dollars and cents wise what's going on there. But I think did I say that Gonzaga? Yeah, Gonzaga is the only college team I think I know that's on there. I forgot if I actually got to that point. Anyways, so yeah, it's interesting for me to watch. Definitely, a decision for the fan base that I think is going to pay off long term. I think that you're going to see, in terms of sales and things like it's easier to make fans when people can see your team.
So I would, just as an anecdote, my mom and my aunt are huge Blazer fans, or always have been. And I grew up going to games with them. It was my mom, my aunt, my grandmother who would take me to games. They live in a rural part of the state where they don't have cable. And they have had Dish Network for probably 25 plus years. There aren't a ton of options where they are. And I believe they have not been able to watch the Trailblazers since they made the move to NBC Sports Northwest, which was 2007, I believe. So for 17 years, you have pretty loyal Blazer fans who have not been able to watch the team. Now, there is the option of DirecTV, I guess. But at a certain point, it does become an economic decision, and and people are making the best decision for themselves, and it's a cost benefit of what it's ultimately worth to you. So I mean, it's not impossible, but it can create a hardship. And so now to have I suppose 82 games now available to fans who have been either priced out or logistically locked out of watching the games, it's an opportunity for the Blazers to reconnect with the state and their fan base, that isn't coming to games or isn't just all in, whatever the price of watching the games. And one thing I'm interested in, Brenna, and you talked about kind of the in the business perspective on this. I think I'm interested in what happens kind of from a horse race standpoint of who ends up getting the Blazers, because I know there is some competition in market to get them. And I don't know what you can or would want to say about that, given the fact that you work for one of the channels that I think, at least from the outside looking in, people would see as a contender to get the Blazers.
Yeah,
Coin has the CW as an alternate station to handle conflicts. The CW has obviously gone into sports, which is different from what we're talking about. But I mean, there seems something natural there. KPTV has KPTX channel 13. Is it still channel 13? It was always channel 13. But it's not.
I don't know, to be honest with you.
KPTV, KPDX, owned by Gray. Gray handled the New Orleans and Phoenix transition from RSN to local, which seems like there's a partnership with the Blazers and KPTV there. They've broadcast games in the past. They did a preseason game, I believe, last year.
They have the remix.
They have the remix. So there's like sort of a natural partnership there. But then and maybe that's where they end up going. That maybe makes the most sense. That said, then you look at K2, which doesn't have the additional station, and maybe doesn't seem as natural fit in that way, but owned by Sinclair, which has stations up and down the state of Oregon. And so all of a sudden you'd be not just putting the Blazers on local television in Portland and however far out KPTV broadcasts, but you'd be to potentially be putting them, in native markets
Eugene,
throughout
Medford.
the state. Eugene, Medford. Am I missing one? Is there one more? Salem?
Salem doesn't have a station. That's in the Portland market. Although did Sinclair shut down their Medford station? They might have.
But I would like to point. Oh, go ahead. Make your point.
There were a few Sinclair stations around the country that got shut down in the last 8 months, and
So I just would point you to a statement that Dwayne Hankins made to me in when was this? April. And I just think that when you're thinking about what the Blazers are going to end up doing and who the Blazers are going to end up being with, we're exploring all the opportunities for the evolving and rapidly changing landscape with a goal of making Blazer games available to the widest audience possible. Well, if we're talking local news stations or news companies that own the most, or that basically can get the Blazers in the most homes for essentially free, that would suggest Sinclair. So I think it's just going to be interesting to see kind of what happens from a horse race standpoint. I don't know that fans really care. Like once it's I think fans outside of Portland maybe care if it's not going to be, if they're going to have to opt for the streaming option instead of the, hey, it's free from my local news station standpoint. But here's the thing that I want to circle all back to about how this actually impacts fans and what I think of the kind of the state of the Blazers. I think the Blazers are poised to start winning fans back over in the state of Oregon. Because I think there are a few things happening. The Blazers are going to be watchable, which I think is a huge part of it. And I also think they're going to be watchable from an entertainment standpoint. They're not going to be good this year. And I don't think, if you haven't been watching the Blazers because you haven't been able to watch the games or you've been turned off by, this, that, or the other thing, don't come back thinking this is going to be a 40, or even 30 win team. That's not where they are in their development.
I say, please don't be watchable this year? Anyways, continue.
But I think,
please don't be good this year. Sorry. Please don't be good this year.
They won't be good. I think that there's something, though, that I think a fan base can get behind a team that is bad but still has purpose. And the Blazers have, at this point, half a dozen young players who they are really committed to the development of. And, this is not the starting five, and this may not be a lineup we ever see because it's awfully young and inexperienced, but you can put a lineup of the Blazers on the floor right now that is Scoot Henderson, Shaedon Sharpe, Donovan Clingan, Denny Advia, and Toumani Camara. And that is an exciting lineup. Now, they would get absolutely run by most, 5-minute lineups in the NBA. But, I don't know. I think the idea of, Donovan Clingan getting a stop at the rim and Denny Advia, running the break from as the four-man, and, that's just exciting. And so I think there is something to look forward to from that standpoint. And then there's this other piece. And this is something we're going to talk about so much over the next year that we're going to get tired of it. And we've touched on it before. We definitely talked a lot about it on our last podcast. But it's the Cooper Flag element of this season.
Which is why I said, please don't be good.
And the Blazers are not the only team that is going to be in position to, win the lottery and draft Cooper Flag. But there hasn't been a draft like this where the Blazers have been in it with a chance to win the lottery
Mhm.
in a really long time. And
Yeah.
even if you go back to Wemby, 2 years ago, the Wembanyama draft where the Blazers ended up getting Scoot, the
Yep.
Blazers were not going into that year.
No.
They were not in the tank for Wemby camp category. It wasn't until January or February when they kind of pulled the plug and they got to like 5th, I think, and then were able to jump up and get into the top 3 and draft Scoot. Obviously winning that lottery and drafting Wembanyama would have been franchise altering, but that wasn't kind of the mission of the season. I think there is actually something unifying about watching a team knowing that you're watching young guys grow, but also it's fine if they don't win. You don't want to do that forever, but like I
No.
do, and I know Blazer fans are tired of the losing, but I just think there is something unifying about watching this team, hoping that like this is with the belief that that there's something waiting on the end that's gonna be really rewarding, and whether it's Cooper Flagg, Ace Bailey, there's a few guys at the top of the draft who are extremely highly regarded beyond Cooper Flagg. But I mean, if it is Cooper Flagg, I mean, my goodness, you're going to want to be familiar with the guys who are on the team because they're going to need to be ready to go once he arrives.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with everything you're saying. I think that there's also something to be said about getting in on the ground floor with a bunch of young guys. Like, they do have a base right now. And so, and that, I mean, obviously not all of them are sticking around because that's just the nature of the beast, but you have something kind of percolating with this group right now where there's at least a direction. Whereas, like, last year around this time, it didn't really feel like there was much of a direction there. They were still kind of like middling their way through. And I mean, last year around this time, we still didn't know where Damian was going.
Yes.
So, now that kind of the Damian situation is handled, there's some lesser, not lesser, but not as impactful to the fan base trades that are going to have to be made down the line, but those are just going to be more accepted. It isn't a cloud hanging over the franchise's head like Damian was.
Right.
Now that cloud is gone, and now it's like, okay, we all kind of know there's no question of what this season is going to look like. You know what this season's going to look like. So when you go into a season like this, you're like, okay, I know not to have my expectations high. So, like, I have to find the good in what is going on out there every night. And the fact that, some of these guys will be around for a while. Hopefully. Well, hopefully the tank doesn't tank. That gives you at least something to kind of hold on to know that this could be the core of the future. So, no, I think you're totally right in the fact that this is a good time to just kind of start fresh in terms of this TV deal. We both knew that there was just, I said on the last podcast that didn't go up, worst kept secret of all time. We all knew this was happening. It was honestly a shock that it took this long to me. I thought we were going to have this news in like May. So, yeah, I mean, that's that. So now we just wait and see. By the way, Sinclair does own the station in Medford. They just don't do local news out of it anymore. So
got it.
There you go.
So there you go. So you have, and because they have Eugene, Portland, Medford.
You're missing Bend. They don't have a station in Bend.
Do they? And they don't. And Ben doesn't pull one of the doesn't pull K2 or doesn't pull KVAL.
No, Bend has 2 stations. Bend is a fascinating TV market that is way in the woods for me to talk about on this podcast. But
next time on the media episode of this podcast, which this one's becoming. Did one thing is interesting, Brenna, is this just talking about the Blazers and their young core. David Aldridge from The Athletic, member of the Naismith Memorial Basketball Hall of Fame, legendary sports media figure, wrote a piece recently and kind of assessing the state of teams around the league. But one of the things he said was that it seems like the Blazers have their backcourt of the future in Scoot Henderson and Anthony Simons. And I've always looked at it from a totally different lens, which is that if there's an odd man out here, it's Anthony. And I'm wondering if you see I'm just so far down the road of Anthony Simons is the guy who's going to have to be traded when the rubber meets the road with this backcourt. is there a way of looking at it in your mind where Anthony does not get traded? Maybe Shaden Sharp, or even Scoot Henderson, I suppose, in this scenario, ends up being the proverbial carrot that the Blazers dangle for another piece when they are ready to start buying being buyers in the trade market.
Yeah. I think that if Anthony were to not get traded, the only way I could see that happening is if he establishes himself as a legitimate point guard.
Yeah.
Because that is the biggest question right now for out of those three is, you kind of know, Shaden's sliding in at the 2. Like, that's what it is. Shaden is a 2. So then it becomes, okay, if Anthony all of a sudden breaks out as this great point guard, then you've got some question marks. But yeah, I think Anthony has always kind of been qualified as a 2. So that doesn't mean he can't play point guard. In fact, there's a lot of talk. I've seen a lot of talk online about how people believe he could be a really good point guard. People who know things, who follow basketball, who are, people who I trust. But so far, it hasn't really felt like that has been established. And I don't know if that's really anybody's fault, just because of the injury palooza that has been the Blazers over the last however many years. So it's been hard to establish anything in terms of a rhythm because, okay, well, all right, Shaden's out. Ant, you're sliding to the 2. Okay, Ant's out. All right, that's going to be Scoot and Shaden then. Oh, Scoot's out. Oh, gosh, I guess Anthony's going to the 1. Right. And so because of that chaos, it has made it really difficult to really have a clear vision of, okay, who are the starters here? Because you can't, it's a constant, I said it's a rotating cast of characters. It's just sub in, sub out, sub in, sub out, because somebody's always hurt. I mean, I'd love to know how many games the 3 of them were healthy for last year. I mean, the opener, I remember in January, they had the whole starting lineup healthy for the first time since the opener. Wait, no. Was that December? I think it was. It was December. And then immediately it was gone again. It was midway through December that they had the starting lineup all healthy, I think, again. And then it didn't happen. So when you have that sort of chaos, it's really hard to establish anything. So I don't necessarily think it's Anthony's fault. But if Anthony wants to stick around, he has to establish himself as the point guard of the future, I think.
Yeah, I mean, the problem with the idea of Scoot and Ant as the backcourt of the future is that you then have a couple of 6'3" guards. And the Blazers have done that in their, it looked different, obviously, but like that's kind of that defined the last decade. So I don't think that that's the route they want to go. Shaden Sharp obviously gives them a much more prototypical modern shooting guard, and Scoot Henderson, theoretically pairs really naturally with him. If you're making the decision to, continue to commit to Ant in the backcourt and move one of Scoot or Shaden or one of those guys as a long-term 6th man, well, then it's more of an indictment of the choices you made in those drafts, because that's not where you should be at this point, especially with Ant now being 24 and, midway through his second contract. I mean, he's going to be due for another really big contract in 2026. And are the Blazers going to be the team to give him that? They shouldn't be if Scoot and Shaden are on the right trajectory. So, thanks. I was curious what you thought of that. I want to turn our attention. He's
25, by the way.
Oh, okay. So sorry. I'm sorry to trap you in the fountain of youth, Anthony Simons.
It's actually insane to think that Anthony Simons is 25 because he's been here for so long.
It is funny, and I will tell you, the first time I remember seeing Anthony Simons was, I guess, so his rookie year was 2018, and the Blazers came to LA for a game. And I obviously had not been around the Blazers at that point. I was covering the Lakers. And I remember just walking around the court. And like, I knew Anthony Simons by name. I knew the Blazers had drafted him, but I wasn't following the team that closely at the time. I was just walking around the court before the game, and I saw Ant on the floor doing drills. And I was like, ball boy killing time waiting for the team to come out because he looked so young. I was like, I remember like it. I feel like it was the only time covering the NBA where I had this experience where I looked at a player on the team and was like, whose kid is that? It was utterly jarring. And I remember having sort of like a kind of gobsmacking moment at how young he looked. And now he's, become this like, pretty mature, leader of this team, a father. It's been cool to watch. Obviously, I've only seen the last couple of years of it, but I mean, even the growth over the last few years has been pretty striking, especially as we're talking about him taking on a bigger, ownership stake of the on-court product since so many of those other veterans have left.
Anthony, babyface gang unite. I feel you, buddy. All right.
Yeah, me too. I get that all the time.
Yeah. People think I'm much younger than what I am, which sometimes leads to a definitely I was at Fred Meyer last night. I definitely got hit on by like a 20-year-old Fred Meyer worker, and I'm just like, I gotta get out of here. These are real things. Oh, well, things that I shared on the podcast.
Turning the page to Oregon football. Speaking of 20-year-olds, Brenna, we've talked about the Ducks, ad nauseum. You and I are both ready to see this team get out on the field and play. There's, so much excitement. The AP poll last week came out, had them at number 3. You are a voter in the AP top 25. You had them at number 3. One voter had them at number 1, Brett McMurphy. But needless to say, this is a team that is seen as having extremely realistic CFP championship aspirations.
Mm-hmm.
Dan Lanning has said this is the most talented team he's had in his 3 years at Oregon, which is saying something considering the amount of talent they put in the NFL last spring. A school record 9 players in the draft. Heisman finalist, probably wins the Heisman if they don't lose that Pac-12 championship game to Washington. So all of that. And we did talk about the Ohio State game last week on our episode that we did not end up publishing. We're going to come back to that another time. But as you look at the schedule for the Ducks, it lines up really well, I think you'd say. Ohio State at home. You catch Michigan in a little bit of a down year, certainly down from where they were a year ago.
Mm-hmm.
You're home a ton. You're not on the road very much in this first year in the Big Ten. It lines up really well for, the Ducks to either sweep the table or to get by with maybe one loss. But I'm wondering if there is in your mind a trap game on this schedule where the Ducks are going to be vulnerable more than maybe people are giving them credit for or are thinking at this point.
I'm going to go with the Michigan State game.
That's on my list.
It's on your list? I mean, you've got a coach at Michigan State who knows how to beat Oregon.
Mm-hmm.
That's not a question. He knows how to beat Dan Lanning. He has beat Dan Lanning before. You have quarterback and Aiden Childs that sure looked like he was coming on strong last year. And, I would imagine he's pretty hungry to beat the Ducks after the beatdown of last season. It's a Friday night game. So that's, a little bit out of the norm. Autzen might not be as hot as it normally is because of that. And then, it's coming off of the UCLA game. So you play your first opponent in the Big Ten is a Pac-12 opponent. So you're kind of familiar. Whereas that really to me feels like the first Big Ten game because it's an unfamiliar opponent. Now, is it totally an unfamiliar opponent because you know the head coach? Yeah, they do. The Ducks have that advantage, but there's a bunch of like little quirks about that game to me where I'm like, all right, that is possible. And yes, Oregon beat up on Oregon State last year, but we all know that it's basically been admitted that nobody in that program was really super focused on that game that week because there were so many rumors going around, and it just kind of made the team kind of cannibalize itself. It was a rough week for them. So for them to come out and compete in that game was going to be pretty hard. So yeah, I think that one I like that one as a bit of a sleeper.
I think that you and I are looking at this kind of the same way, because I think when we talk about letdown games, the natural place to, or trap games, the natural place to look is at the biggest game on the schedule, and then on either side of it, right? There is a risk of overlooking an opponent, and then on the back end, there's a risk of having a letdown after a really, potentially huge performance.
Yeah.
Michigan State is going to be traveling west in that game for a night game in Eugene. Potential for some weather, but who knows? Early enough in October, maybe you don't have to worry as much about it. But
yeah,
that game's going to be at essentially 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock their time. I think the Ducks are going to be fine against the Spartans. I think the Michigan State it's going to take Jonathan Smith some time. My trap game is, again, we're looking at this exactly the same way, just on the flip side. I looked at next weekend at Purdue. Purdue was picked to be the worst team in the Big Ten. People who have watched Purdue in fall camp say there's some talent there. Maybe not as bad as we think. Also, it's going to be the Ducks' first true road game in the Big Ten. Just like you said, they're UCLA, familiar territory. Not for this staff or any of the players on this roster, but Pac-12 venue, Pac-12 opponent, West Coast time zone. It's going to feel pretty familiar down here for UCLA. So the first true Big Ten road trip is to West Lafayette the week after Ohio State at home. I don't know if Purdue has the ability to hang with the Ducks. I don't know if on their best day they can hold that offense at bay. But when I think about like the factors of a trap game, I think that Purdue game has the potential to be a little iffy. So that would be my pick. But I mean, that is not, and correct me if I'm wrong, that is also a Friday night game. So, those non-Saturday day games have some tendencies to get weird. Friday night game, West Lafayette, Indiana. I'm not picking Purdue, don't get me wrong. I'm just saying I wouldn't overlook the Boilers in that game because I think that there's a risk of they shorten it to Boilers.
They did?
They didn't. They do, like, casually.
Oh,
like,
no,
sort of like the Zags.
I wasn't correcting you.
Oh, okay.
Okay,
fine.
I was just giving it the full proper name.
That's fine. So will the Boilermakers be upset makers on October 18th? That's my question.
I'm sure you're the first person to ever say that. Great work.
Thank you.
You can tell we're just ready to see this team. Like, let's get it going. And to be honest,
I mean, like, I could say sure. I mean, you go to Camp Randall with like 90,000 fans in November. Like, could the Ducks lose that game? Yeah. Could the Ducks lose, at Michigan? Yeah. But that's not interesting. What's interesting is, like, is there a point in the schedule where this team that we view as just an utter juggernaut lets its foot off the gas at an inopportune time and gets taken advantage of, which happens. Now, what I will say is that is not something we've seen from a Dan Lanning team.
That's exactly what was on my tongue next.
And the closest you could come to saying we've seen from a Dan Lanning team is that second half against Oregon State in 2022.
Yeah.
But even that, like, I mean, that was against a really high quality opponent. Oregon State was very good that year. So that is not like even what we're talking about here, where Michigan State and Purdue are two, rebuilding teams in the Big Ten. And it would be the first time in the Dan Lanning era that we've seen the Ducks really let one go like that.
Absolutely. Yeah. I don't count Oregon State.
So a little. Speaking of the Beavers, a little Beaver talk.
Yeah.
This week, because the Beavers are now a week and a half away from their own opener against Idaho State. Speaking of Big Sky football, and while we feel like we know everything about the Ducks as they make the transition to the Big Ten, I feel like we know almost as little about the Beavers as we know as much about the Ducks.
Yeah,
if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
And the biggest question mark continues to be quarterback. 3 contenders for that job. We've talked about them before. Ben Gulbranson, who has started, I want to say 10 games in his career for the Beavers. Won 8, 7 or 8. Has only lost twice as the quarterback of the Beavers. And you have Jabari Johnson transfer from Missouri out of the Seattle area, Tacoma, and Giovanni McCoy transfer from Idaho. Was one of the best players in the FCS last year. Ben Gulbranson is really interesting. And our Nick Daschle, my Nick Daschle, not your Nick Daschle, everyone's Nick Daschle, the Oregonians' Nick Daschle, had sort of been planting the seeds throughout the summer that there might be a chance that Ben Gulbranson would still end up being the starting quarterback on this team. And I really didn't see it, just for the simple fact that, he's been in the program. He's not the most talented guy out there. You went out and found 2 players in the portal who should certainly have more upside, are more explosive athletes. But here we are at the end of fall camp, and it seems like Ben Gulbranson still has a chance at being the starter on opening day. How are you viewing this job at this point, and would you be surprised if it's Ben at this point?
I feel like there's more talk right now around Jabari and McCoy. Like, there's just been more chatter when I'm watching media availabilities, because even though, like, I'm not down there, I'm really religious about watching what they talk about every day. So it doesn't feel like Ben's been coming up nearly as much as the other 2. So that's something to just, I guess, think about. That's something that I am percolating. But I mean, I also saw stuff a few weeks ago from camp where Nick wrote like he thought that Ben had the inside track of getting the gig.
Mm-hmm.
He thought that Ben was showing out more than the other 2, but that was a few weeks ago. So things change, I do know that they're going to name that starting quarterback at the end of this week. That's the timeline. So this is not going to be a mystery in a few days who's the starter, but we're just kind of waiting and seeing right now. It's hard to, really get a read on things when you're not there every day, which is impossible for the 2 of us. And, you just kind of have to take what hints you can get. And my hints currently, just watching media availabilities, is that the other 2 are coming up way more than Ben is.
So my understanding from Nick is, Johnson finally started getting more reps with the ones in practices. Yeah. Oregon State, by the way, is great. I mean, you can go, for most of fall camp, watch the majority practice.
We appreciate you.
And and not that they're looking to have trade secrets reported, but you can get a little you can get some hints along the way, and their scrimmages the last 2 weeks. It just seems like, and from what I've read and heard from Nick and my conversations around people, Jabari Johnson, Giovanni McCoy, they're making some mistakes. They're throwing some bad passes. They're throwing
Yep.
some interceptions. Ben Gulbranson is old faithful, steady Eddie. And, we always count that guy out, and he still finds a way, it feels like, to deliver.
Except for the Notre Dame game. Continue.
Which was, the Notre Dame game, yes.
Not his fault.
It wasn't, but also, like, that game was, like, kind of, it was competitive in the first half. Nobody was scoring is part of it. But I would just say that nothing about Ben Gulbranson surprises me anymore, because everything that you can point to and say, well, like, okay, do Beaver fans really want to watch another Ben Gulbranson season? Like, it doesn't exactly, like, get your heart palpitating. But if he's not going to make mistakes, he's not going to turn the ball over a ton. Do you need that? Obviously you want an electric quarterback who's going to set the world on fire and is going to throw for 500 yards. But if that same quarterback is going to throw, 6 interceptions, that, and I'm not to say that Johnson or McCoy is, but that's sort of the calculus I think the coaching staff has to weigh. And so I don't think it is out of the question anymore that Ben Gulbranson, who I thought was going to transfer last year, DJ Uiagalelei comes in, Hayden Childs comes in. It's like, all right, Ben Gulbranson, like, writing's on the wall, Montana needs you, sort of thing, and then he sticks around, ends up starting the bowl game, which kind of whatever, but like ends up starting the bowl game. And now here he is in a position to, potentially be the starter at the beginning of the season. Just a really interesting kind of arc in this new age of college football. And, I think Jabari Johnson, probably the most talented guy they have there at that position, hasn't had a ton of live reps in college football. He's had a spring and a fall to learn the Oregon State system. I remember last year there was even, I don't want to say controversy around the quarterback position, because I don't think anybody ever really believed that anyone other than DJ was going to be the starter at OSU. But he had a really rough spring. The reports coming out of Oregon State were like, this guy. And then it was finally that second scrimmage they had where the coaches were like, all right, we see it. He has gotten in sync with these receivers. We trust him. That's our guy. That could still be true of Jabari Johnson. I suppose it could still be true of Giovanni McCoy by the end of camp or a few weeks into the season too. But in the meantime, Ben Gulbranson gives you a really, really good, reliable option and somebody that you trust. You go back to, again, that Oregon game in 2022, he throws a couple of picks, Beavers are in trouble, and all of a sudden, he game manages them to a wild comeback victory, mostly on the legs of Damian Martinez, Jam Griffin, and Deshaun Fenwick, but a guy who's been there. So I do think you'll see more than one quarterback for the Beavers this season, but Ben Gulbranson, I think, is really validating his decision to stick around and finish his career at Oregon State.
Can I make one as the broadcaster in me?
Yes.
It's Gulbranson.
Doesn't matter. Print journalist, written word.
These are things that I like. If you're watching online, you may have seen me on my phone, because I was like, man, I feel like I've been pronouncing this right all these years, but now I just gotta double check.
Like Branson, Missouri? Gulbranson?
Yeah. In the pronunciation
Gulbranson,
guide,
Missouri?
In the pronunciation guide, it is spelled GULL-BRAN-SON. So
okay then. All right. Yeah. All right. Well, now you obviously need the job to go to Jabari Johnson or Giovanni McCoy, so I never have to feel this shame ever again.
I'm sorry. It's the broadcaster in me, as somebody who has to pronounce names way too often. Who, oh my god, names are the toughest part of my job. Like, full stop. Because a lot of times you can think you have a name down, and then you get out there and you just like see it on the prompter, and you're like, man, I think I'm pronouncing this right, but I might not be. So Yeah, there you go. As somebody, I'm hypersensitive to names, so there you have
Is
it.
it
But yeah,
Gulbranson or Gulbranson? I think
is there
I
a difference there?
yes, there is a difference. Broadcaster person.
Okay.
Just saying.
Okay. Well,
Gulbranson. Gulbranson.
that's a very slight difference.
Just saying.
Okay. Well, we can clarify this whenever you're at an Oregon State game next. So
After the Idaho State game, first question.
please pronounce your name.
Yeah.
I
hope he
think
starts that game so we can get him.
Exactly. Yeah. I think that that's an astute idea that we will see more than one quarterback this year for Oregon State. But we'll see what happens. It's going to be resolved soon enough, but I'm just ready for that to
I guess the reason this intrigues me is because Ben Gulbranson is sort of the steady Eddie.
He's so different than the other two in terms of play style as well.
I just really, you don't go get two players out of the transfer portal who you don't go get two players out of the transfer portal at that position who, had options if you expect Ben Gulbranson to be the guy. Now, granted, they love Ben. They have trust in Ben. I'm not trying to denigrate Ben, but obviously you were looking to upgrade the position from what you already had. And so it does surprise me in that sense. It will surprise me in that sense if, at least by mid-year, we're not talking about one of these other guys winning the job. And then it becomes a question of, well, what went wrong, I guess. But, that also assumes that Ben doesn't have them at 6-0. I don't think they're going to beat Oregon, but, they could be 5-1, 6-1. And if you're rolling with Gulbranson, why do you make a change? So, I don't know. It's going to be interesting to watch.
This is going to be a thing now the rest of the year if Ben Gulbranson starts, isn't it?
If Ben Gulbranson
going to make
starts,
sure that you're going to just make sure to emphasize that part of his name every time, right?
Gulbranson, yeah, I'm on it. I've been pronunciation guide shamed.
I just would like to say one other random Oregon State note. Last night I was listening to Stu Mandel and Bruce Feldman's podcast.
Yeah.
They brought up 3 Beaver transfers at different programs around the country. Would you want to take a stab at who the 3 players were that they brought up? First one's obvious.
I'm assuming Damian Martinez.
No.
Really? Okay. Okay. Aiden Childs.
No.
So obvious.
This is illustrating so much to me. This is making my point even further.
DJ Uiagalelei.
Yes.
At Florida State. And one of the Arnolds at USC, if not both.
Correct. Yes.
Easton.
Easton was the one that got brought up, yes. The other one you may be forgetting about.
Silas Bolden at Texas.
Yes. So you just named, before we even got to those 3, 2 other players that could have easily been brought up on that podcast.
Yeah, the Aiden Childs one, I was not I was a little less certain about Aiden Childs. Damian Martinez, I did think was going to be the answer. Aiden Childs is going to be in a development year at Michigan State. But anyway, continue.
Yeah, and it just made me so sad listening to this podcast. And they did not really, I think for Bolden, they did mention that he was an Oregon State transfer. For Easton, they did not. And I'm sitting there and I'm just like, man, this team could have been so insanely good this year if there's already 3 guys who transferred out who are getting brought up on a national football podcast. That is insane.
One of the things I asked Jonathan Smith
made me sad.
I asked Jonathan Smith a very similar question to that at Big Ten Media Days. I obviously tracked him down to talk about leaving Oregon State and all that, but in kind of his formal media session, I asked him just about the idea that, DJ's at Florida State, Damian's at Miami, Silas is at Texas, the Arnolds are at USC. And like, does it, especially because all those guys on last year's team carried a weight beyond football. They were essentially these flag bearers for, Oregon State-dom kind of in the face of so much adversity. And to then see them scatter in the wind the way they have is certainly disorienting. But I also think it is sad. I think it's sad because there was such a rallying cry for Oregon State a year ago.
Yeah.
And I think the players felt that. I think it might have been a little unfair on the players. They didn't sign up to be for all of that. But to see them now suddenly, all over the country, and that doesn't exist in the same way. And, I think it is sad. And I think for Beaver fans, it's just kind of gutting because that team, if that team had stuck together, right, and whether it was DJ or Aiden Childs at quarterback, you'd be talking about a top 15 team right now.
Mm-hmm.
And considering that's a team without a home, without a conference, without a certain future, like that would be pretty darn, exciting for Beaver fans to rally around. I mean, they would look better than any of these Mountain West teams that are going to be playing this year, with the exception maybe of Boise State, but probably even Boise State. And better than Boise State. Yeah, confidently better than Boise State at this point. And instead, it's just, it's just, we don't know what Oregon State is. They could be good, they could be bad, they could be, who knows? And, I think the Beavers will get back there in some form, but it's like it was right there, it was right in front of you, and now you can watch all these players on Saturdays, but they're all over the place. So I think it's a really salient point, and something that I think Oregon State fans, if they allow themselves to think about it, it's got to hurt. I mean, all these guys are playing for national, on teams that are going to be in contention for national championships, are difference makers on really high visibility teams. I mean, Silas Bolden, is he the X factor at Texas? He might be. So I agree that it's a tough pill to swallow.
Yeah, it's just that was like, I was just sitting there in my kitchen putting away groceries, like, oh, another dagger to the heart. All right, cool. Like, and this is coming from somebody who, I didn't necessarily I'll totally admit that I grew up an Oregon fan. Now, I grew up with a mom who went to Oregon State. My family has a pretty deep history there. 4 generations worth. So it's not like I was like, oh, I dislike Oregon State growing up. That was not how it was. But, it makes you feel for, for me, like as just an Oregonian, it makes me feel some type of way. And then it makes you feel for the people that around that program. Like, because once you start, covering these teams, you obviously get to know people, and you're just like, man, this team this year would have been unreal if everything would have gone according to plan. But, that's life. Life doesn't go according to plan. And now we get to see Damian Martinez running around in a Miami jersey and Silas Bolden running around in a Texas jersey, and see how it all unfolds. So it's just, it just was so, I just wasn't expecting it last night when I was listening to that program, to keep hearing about players that I used to cover.
Yeah.
And so it really kind of crystallized for me in that moment last night.
Yeah. And there's more too. I mean, there's other guys that you could point to. I mean, it's obviously a huge number. And I will say, I talked to Jack Velling at Big Ten Media Days, and one thing he said, he was like, he was just like, I do miss Corvallis. I miss Oregon State. It's like, obviously he's on to bigger things. I also watched him drool over the national championship trophy for a while, and like, those aspirations, that wouldn't have maybe been, I mean, not that they're realistic at Michigan State now, but like, I think he felt the, Big Ten pretty cool, but like, these decisions are not made easily. Players are leaving friends, family, a lot of really good intentions behind when they transfer. So I think that those feelings are felt not just by, you, me, and fans watching these teams, but by the players themselves, and also Jonathan Smith, who did acknowledge that it was sad. It was sad to see. So I'm glad you took us there, Brenna. Thank you very much. Good note for us to end on. Not a super happy note, but a good note for us to end on. we have successfully recorded this podcast, which
Oh
is
my
a
gosh.
vast improvement for us. And let's do it again. Let's come back next week.
Sounds good.
It'll be game week, which is exciting.
Thank God.
Thanks to our listeners. We certainly appreciate it. Continue to check out our work, my work, the work of my colleagues at the Oregonian. Catch Brenna on Coin 6. And we'll be back next week to talk about all things on the Oregonian Sports podcast. Thanks for listening.